Nobody noticed her. She sat quietly in seat 12F, an ordinary woman with a paperback book, invisible among travelers. But panic filled the cabin when a fighter jet began falling from the sky. Silence broke until the F-22 squadron heard the call sign, Titan 1, and 8 elite pilots froze. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Diane Cross boarded the morning flight to Colorado Springs the same way she boarded every flight now, quiet and unnoticed. She wore a plain gray jacket and old blue jeans. Her hair was tied back in a simple knot. She carried a small brown bag with a book, a bottle of water, and a pair of reading glasses. Nobody looked at her twice. That was exactly how she liked it. She found her seat, checked the number on her boarding pass, and sat down without a word. She sat quietly in seat 12F, next to the window, and opened her book before the plane had even left the gate. At 45 years old, Diane had learned how to disappear into a crowd. 20 years ago, very few people could disappear less than she could. She had been a fighter pilot, one of the finest the Air Force had ever trained. She had flown missions over deserts and oceans, missions that never made the news, missions that only a small circle of people ever knew about. But that life was behind her now, or so she told herself every single morning when she woke up in her small house in Texas and got ready to teach mathematics to teenagers who had no idea who she used to be. Diane had flown thousands of miles in silence over the past 3 years, always choosing a window seat, always keeping a book close so no one would try to start a conversation. She had learned that people rarely looked twice at a quiet woman reading near the back of the plane, and she preferred it that way. The busy world of teaching, grading papers, and grocery shopping had replaced the world of briefings, cockpits, and midnight missions, and most days she was grateful for the change. But some mornings, when the sky outside her window turned a certain shade of orange, she still felt a small ache in her chest, a memory of a life she had once loved with her whole heart before it broke her. The flight attendant offered her coffee, and Diane accepted with a small, polite smile. She thanked the woman quietly and turned back to her book. Around her, the plane filled with ordinary travelers, families going on vacation, business people typing on laptops, and a group of young men and women near the front of the cabin who stood out because of their uniforms. They wore the dark blue dress uniforms of Air Force pilots, and they carried themselves with the kind of confidence that comes from being young, talented, and full of pride. They were part of an F-22 squadron heading to a public airshow, where they would perform flying tricks for thousands of people on the ground. Their leader was a tall young man named Captain Ryan Combs. He had a wide smile and an easy way of talking that made the people around him laugh. Beside him sat Lieutenant Maya Torres, a sharp young pilot who checked her phone every few minutes even though there was no signal in the sky. Behind them sat 2 more pilots, Lieutenant David Kim and Captain Elena Brooks, both laughing about something one of them had said. They were proud of their skills, and they had every reason to be. They were some of the best young pilots in the country. But like most young people, they still believed they had seen everything important there was to see in their profession. As the flight settled into its cruising height, the young pilots began talking about old stories from flight school. One of them mentioned a name that made Diane's hand tighten slightly around her book. Titan 1. She kept her eyes on the page, but she was no longer reading the words. You ever hear the stories about Titan 1? Captain Combs asked the group. My instructor used to talk about that pilot like they were some kind of ghost. I heard Titan 1 flew over 100 missions and never lost a single wingman, said Lieutenant Kim. That sounds like something people made up to scare us into working harder. My father flew with Titan 1 once, Lieutenant Torres said quietly. He said it was real. He said nobody flew like that pilot. He said Titan 1 could read the sky like it was written in a book. Then why isn't Titan 1 still flying? Captain Brooks asked. If someone was really that good, you would think they would still be up there. Nobody knows, Combs said, shrugging. Some people say Titan 1 disappeared. Some people say they just walked away one day and never came back. My instructor told me something strange once, Lieutenant Kim added, leaning forward in his seat. He said Titan I never lost a single wingman in over 100 missions, except for the very last one. He said that mission ended everything. Titan I just vanished after that, no retirement ceremony, no goodbye, nothing. One day the call sign, Titan I, simply stopped appearing on any flight roster in the entire Air Force. That is exactly the kind of story that gets bigger every time someone tells it, Captain Brooks said, laughing softly. By the time we retire, people will be saying Titan I could fly without an aircraft at all. Maybe, Torres said quietly, staring out the window at the clouds below. Or maybe some of the best pilots in history are sitting somewhere ordinary right now, and none of us would even notice. Combs laughed at that idea, shaking his head, unaware of how close to the truth his fellow pilot had come. None of them turned around to look at the quiet woman 2 rows behind them, the woman who had once carried that very name into more dangerous skies than any of them had ever seen. Diane closed her eyes for a moment. She remembered every one of those missions, every early morning, every late night landing under the stars. She remembered the friend she had lost, a pilot named Captain Owen Reyes, who had died on her watch during her final mission. She remembered the silence after his last radio call, a silence that had followed her every day since. She had made a promise to herself after that day. She would never fly again. She would never put anyone's life in her hands again. That promise had held for 3 long years. The young pilots kept talking, unaware that the woman 2 rows behind them had once been the very legend they were discussing. Diane returned to her book, though her mind was far away, somewhere over a desert 20 years in the past. She told herself the past was the past. She was just a passenger now, someone heading to visit an old friend for the weekend, nothing more. About an hour into the flight, the comm cabin changed in an instant. The captain's voice came over the speakers, tight and urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have received an emergency radio call from a military aircraft nearby. If there are any active duty Air Force personnel on board, please press your call button right away." Captain Combs was on his feet before the announcement even finished. His fellow pilots followed him, moving quickly toward the front of the plane. A flight attendant met them halfway down the aisle, her face pale. "There is a fighter jet in trouble," she said quickly. "The pilot is losing control. Our radio cannot understand military frequencies well. The captain thinks you might be able to help." The 4 young pilots hurried into the forward area of the plane, where the flight crew had rigged a weak connection between the cockpit radio and the cabin speaker system. Through crackling static, a young voice broke through, shaking and afraid. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Falcon 2. I have lost my hydraulic systems. My controls are not responding. I am descending fast and I do not know how much longer I can hold this aircraft steady." Captain Combs grabbed the handset from the flight attendant. "Falcon 2, this is Captain Combs of the F-22 Squadron. We are on a passenger aircraft trying to help you. What is your position and altitude?" The answer came back broken and distorted, but the fear in the young pilot's voice was clear. He gave rough numbers for his altitude and speed, numbers that told Combs and the others that the situation was very serious. An aircraft without hydraulic power could not be steered in any normal way. Without help, the pilot would have no choice but to eject over open land, and even that carried great danger at his current speed. "Falcon 2, try your manual backup controls," Combs said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Already tried," the pilot answered. His voice cracked. "Nothing is responding. I have maybe 2 minutes before I lose everything, including engine control. I have a wife and a baby son at home. Please, if anyone can hear me, tell them I tried." The young pilots looked at each other in the tight space of the galley, their faces filled with the same helpless fear. They had trained for years, they had studied every manual, but none of their training had prepared them to guide a dying aircraft through a weak civilian radio while sitting on a passenger plane thousands of feet away. Lieutenant Torres pressed her hands against the wall, her eyes wet with tears she refused to let fall. Captain Brooks kept repeating numbers under her breath, trying to calculate a solution that did not exist in any manual she had ever studied. That was the moment Diane stood up from her seat. Her heart pounded, and her hands trembled slightly, but her mind had already begun working through the same calculations she had once made 20 years earlier, in a cockpit very much like the one now falling out of the sky. She walked forward through the aisle, past curious passengers, until she reached the small group crowded around the radio. "Let me through," she said, her voice suddenly steady and clear. Captain Combs turned, surprised to see the quiet woman from seat 12F standing before him. "Ma'am, I am sorry, but this is a military emergency, and Your signal is too weak because the radio is compressing the frequency," Diane said, cutting him off gently but firmly. "There is a way to fix it, but you need to trust me right now, because that pilot does not have much time left." Something in her calm, certain eyes made Combs step aside without another word. Diane moved to the small access panel near the radio equipment, opened it with practiced hands, and adjusted the settings with a speed that stunned the young pilots watching her. Within seconds, the static cleared, and the voice of the frightened pilot came through with sudden clarity. Diane picked up the handset. When she spoke, her voice had changed completely. It was calm, strong, and full of quiet authority. "Falcon 2, this is Titan 1. Listen to my voice and do exactly as I say." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the radio, followed by a shaky reply. "Titan 1. I thought that was just a story." Nobody in that quiet, panicked galley truly understood what was happening until the F-22 squadron heard the call sign, Titan 1, come through the static, calm and unmistakable, and every one of them felt the weight of the legend become real in front of their eyes. "I am very real, and so is your aircraft, and we are going to bring it home together," Diane said. "First, tell me your hydraulic pressure reading." For the next several minutes, Diane guided the young pilot through a series of steps that none of the F-22 squadron pilots standing around her had ever learned in their training. She explained how to lock his control surfaces using the last remaining backup pressure, how to manage his fuel weight to create a gentle turn without normal steering, and how to control his descent using only his throttle. Every instruction came from memory, from a day 20 years earlier when she had faced the very same failure over unfamiliar land and had somehow found a way to survive it. The young pilots listened in complete silence, watching this quiet woman transform in front of their eyes. Her hands no longer trembled. Her voice never wavered. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had lived through the exact nightmare now playing out over the radio. Diane kept her eyes closed for a moment, seeing not the cramped galley around her, but the wide brown desert of her own final training flight years ago, when she had discovered these same steps through nothing but fear and desperation. She had never written any of it down in an official manual, because the Air Force had never officially recognized the method, but she had never forgotten a single detail of it either. Every number, every setting, every gentle correction was burned into her memory as clearly as the day it had saved her own life. "Falcon 2, your fuel weight is your best friend right now," Diane continued, her voice never rising, never breaking. "Move 200 pounds to your right tank slowly. You will feel the nose drift. Do not resist it. Let the aircraft lean into the turn on its own." "Moving fuel now," the pilot answered, his breathing sharp and fast over the radio. "I can feel it. The nose is turning." "Good. That is exactly what we want," Diane said. "Now watch your altitude. When you reach 3,000 feet, throttle back slowly. You are flying a glider now, not a jet. Let physics do the work for you." The young pilots standing around her exchanged glances of pure amazement. None of them had ever heard of using fuel weight to steer a jet with no hydraulics, yet the calm woman beside them spoke about it as easily as someone giving directions to a nearby store. Captain Combs found himself thinking that whatever this woman had once been, she was clearly far more than a legend whispered about in flight school hallways. "Falcon 2, you are going to feel like the aircraft wants to climb before it settles. Do not fight it. Let it happen, Diane said as the young pilot approached the runway of a nearby airfield that the local air traffic controllers had cleared for him. "Understood, Titan 1, the pilot answered, his voice steadier now, filled with something that had not been there before. Trust. The final moments were the hardest to hear. The radio filled with the sound of grinding metal and screaming engines as the aircraft touched the runway harder than any normal landing. For several seconds, there was only noise and silence taking turns, until finally, a breathless voice broke through. I am down. I am on the ground. I am alive. The small galley erupted into quiet cheers and disbelieving laughter. Captain Combs let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like hours. Lieutenant Torres wiped tears from her eyes and smiled at Diane with something close to wonder. Diane simply closed her eyes for a moment, feeling 20 years of guilt lift slightly from her shoulders. Titan 1, Combs said quietly, staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. You are actually real. I used to be someone who flew, Diane said softly. Now I am just someone who remembered enough to help. She handed the radio handset back to the flight attendant and returned quietly to her seat, though the entire cabin now watched her with new eyes. When the plane landed at Colorado Springs, a small group of uniformed officers waited at the gate, along with a young pilot who had raced across the state just to meet her in person. He was pale and shaking, but his eyes were bright with life. He thanked her over and over, showing her a photograph of his wife and baby son on his phone, his hands trembling as he held it out to her. You gave me my life back, he said. I do not know how to thank you enough. Diane looked at the photograph, then at the young man standing before her, and felt something she had not felt in 3 long years. Not sadness, not guilt, but a quiet sense of purpose returning to her heart. She had spent 3 years believing her days of saving lives were over, that she had left that part of herself behind on the day her friend had died. But standing in that airport, surrounded by grateful strangers and a squadron of young pilots who now understood the real meaning behind the name Titan 1, she finally understood something important. The skills she had built, the years of hard training, the painful lessons learned through loss, none of it had disappeared. It had simply been waiting quietly, the same way she had been waiting quietly in seat 12F, for the moment someone needed it again. A few months later, Diane stood in front of her classroom of high school students, chalk in hand, explaining the physics of flight to a room full of curious teenagers who had recently learned about her hidden past. One student raised his hand and asked if she missed flying. Diane smiled and shook her head gently. I never really stopped, she said. I just found a new way to help people reach the sky. Outside her classroom window, far above the school, a single contrail stretched across the blue afternoon sky, a quiet reminder that some legends never truly disappear. They simply wait, patient and humble, ready to answer the call whenever it comes. Diane often thought back to that ordinary Tuesday morning, to the quiet woman who had boarded a plane with nothing but a book and a bottle of water, wanting only to disappear into an unremarkable seat for a few peaceful hours. She had not planned to be a hero that day. She had not planned to speak again in a voice she had buried for 3 long years. But when a stranger's life had hung in the balance, something deep inside her had refused to stay silent, and she had discovered that the woman who once sat quietly with her secrets could still rise, calm and certain, whenever the sky called her name.